All right, folks are starting to pour in. You can see that, if you can see the numbers at the bottom of the screen, David, starting to tick up pretty fast. Feels like a lottery.
Nobody's won the Powerball yet.
No, not yet. Well, as folks are starting to load in here, kind of drip, 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 I'll go ahead and get started and welcome everybody. My name is Wiley Cash. I am a novelist living here on the coast of North Carolina, actually in Wilmington, which will be the focus of our discussion tonight. I am the host of Reader Meet Writer. I'm also the 2019 recipient of the Pat Conroy Legacy Award from SIBA, and I am the writer in residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, where we just discussed our author this evening. His daughter is a proud alumnus, Emily Zucchino, tipped off to me by Professor Mark Gibney there in the political science department. I want to say a little bit about SIBA and a little bit about Reader Meet Writer before we begin. SIBA stands for the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance, and this organization represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. And perhaps you are here tonight because one of those bookstores invited you, you saw it on their webpage, you saw it on Facebook, or wherever. If that's the case and you want to buy David's book, consider purchasing it from the bookstore that got you here tonight. We're doing these events regularly. You know, normally David would be on book tour, maybe he'd be at a bookstore in your community, but we can't do that because of the pandemic. And so we are bringing these authors to you in the easiest way we know how, which is over Zoom and other platforms like that. We have a couple of great upcoming events that I want to make sure to let you know about really quickly. Tuesday, February 9th at 7 p.m., I'll be hosting Ariel Lawhon with her novel, Codename Helena, which tells the story of socialite spy Nancy Wake, one of the most decorated women in World War II. And then 2 days later, on February 11th at 7 p.m., I'll be hosting Jerry Mitchell and his book, Race Against Time, a reporter reopens the unsolved murders of the civil rights era. And this is about Jerry Mitchell's work in uncovering four really tragic and horrifying, four of the best known murders of the civil rights era. And so he will be joining us, and it's going to be a fascinating discussion. Tonight's discussion is going to be fascinating too. We have Pulitzer Prize winning writer David Zucchino with us. And so tonight, while David and I are talking, perhaps you'll have a question, you'll have a comment, you'll have something you want to dig deeper on or something you just want to share. If that's the case, go down to the Q&A in the bottom of your screen, type your question or your comment in there. Make sure to mention your name and the name of your home independent bookstore, because I'd like to say your name and give a shout out to your bookstore on the air during the Q&A, and I will feed David your questions at the end of the broadcast. So stick around for that. But without further ado, let me introduce tonight's guest. David Zucchino is a contributing writer for the New York Times. He was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 1989 for his reporting from South Africa. He is a four-time Pulitzer Prize finalist for coverage of Lebanon, Africa, inner-city Philadelphia, and Iraq. He has reported from more than 36 countries, most recently from Iraq. Zucchino is the author of the books Wilmington's Lie, The Murderous Coup of 1898 and the Rise of White Supremacy, Thunder Sun, The Armored Strike to Capture Baghdad, and The Myth of the Welfare Queen. David, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really, really appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Wiley. Thanks for having me.
So, you know, this book set, it takes place primarily, what you're writing about takes place primarily in Wilmington, North Carolina, a coastal city on the Cape Fear River, for those out there who may not be quite as geographically familiar with this area as we are. And Wilmington was a very, very important town nationally, but especially in the state of North Carolina. So can you tell us a little bit about what the city of Wilmington was like, specifically in the 1890s, and how fusionist politics, and if you would kind of explain what fusionist politics or the fusionist party was, and how that political party came to frame the kind of city that Wilmington was post-Reconstruction in the 1890s.
Right. Well, Wilmington in 1898 was really an outlier. It was an unusual city in the South. It was 56% Black, and among the major cities in the South, it probably had the biggest Black population, and it was probably the most integrated city in the South. It was an important city in North Carolina. Of course, it was a port. It was the last port to fall during the Civil War. It was the biggest city in North Carolina at the time. And it had a mixed race government, which infuriated the white supremacists who had really controlled Wilmington before the Civil War and after Reconstruction. And it came about in the early 1890s when there was a bad recession, and the poor white farmers who were part of the Populist Party had really just grown irritated and had basically abandoned the Democrats, who at the time were the party of the white supremacy. And they formed an alliance, and it was called Fusion, with white Republicans and with Black Republicans. And remember, Blacks had only had the right to vote since 1868. And in the early 1890s, they took over the state legislature and the government in Wilmington. Now, in Wilmington, you had 3 of the 10 city councilmen were Black, 10 of the 26 policemen. The county treasurer was Black. A lot of county officials were Black. There was Black magistrates, which really infuriated white supremacists because there were white defendants coming before them. There was a really thriving Black middle class, and at least 60 Black professionals like teachers and doctors and lawyers. So it was really an unusual place, and it was the kind of place that, again, white supremacists decided they were not going to let it stand, and they announced to the world that they weren't going to let it stand.
So, with white supremacy, you mentioned the Fusionist Party. What were the goals of white supremacists? You know, we're only, 25 years post the end of the Civil War. African-American men have had the right to vote since 1868, as you said. What are the goals of white supremacists in the 1890s? You know, you mentioned the Fusionist Party. How did they seek to separate the races and use, you know, these different cultural, political tools to do that?
Well, their most immediate goal, and the one that they announced, was first of all to steal the election of the midterm election of 1898 and to overthrow the government in Wilmington. But their long-term goals were, first of all, to keep Black men from voting ever again. And secondly, to keep Black men from holding public office. And the way they did this was mount what they called, and this was their term, the white supremacy campaign. That's what they called it. This got going in the spring of 1898 and really built during the summer and the fall. And it had sort of 2 prongs to it. The first was the propaganda campaign, the misinformation campaign that was led by the News and Observer of Raleigh through its publisher, Josephus Daniels, who was a member of the executive committee of the Democratic Party. He wasn't really a journalist, but he did happen to own the most powerful newspaper in the state. The second prong was violence, a vigilante movement led by a group called the Red Shirts, which were basically the Proud Boys of 1898. These were white supremacists, heavily armed. Their job during the summer and fall of 1898 was to ride out through the Cape Fear countryside and pull Black men out of their houses at night, beat them and whip them and threaten them that if they dared register to vote, they would come back and kill them. And that really had just a terrifying effect on the Black population. And at the same time, on election day, the Red Shirts just roamed through the streets and stopped every Black man they saw and beat them or intimidated them and kept them from voting. And they were able to steal the election by not only intimidating Black voters and keeping them away from the polls, but going into the polls and just ransacking them. And during the confusion, they would destroy the Republican ballots and replace them with phony Democratic ballots and stole the election. And then 2 days later, they mounted the coup as they had announced.
You mentioned Josephus Daniels, and can you talk a little bit about the Daniels family and the role of the newspaper? And there are several newspapers that play a role here. We have, you know, Josephus Daniels and the Raleigh News and Observer, which you said is the major newspaper in North Carolina, one of the most powerful newspapers probably in the country at the time, certainly in the South. We have the speech that Rebecca Latimer Felton gives at the agricultural meeting, which is printed in newspapers. And then we have a response in Wilmington to Latimer's speech, that is printed in a local newspaper that is a very specific and a very important newspaper. So can you talk about those three things, the News and Observer, Felton, and then the response in the Wilmington newspaper?
Right. At this time, of course, there was no internet and no social media, no radio and TV, but newspapers were king, and that's how people got their information. And the News and Observer was the paper for Eastern North Carolina, although part of the white supremacy campaign were the newspapers in Wilmington, all run by white supremacists. And again, they had this propaganda campaign, and it was so loud and so well known, it attracted the attention of the national press, because they announced that they were going to steal the election, and they're going to win the election by the ballot or the bullet or both. That was their phrase, and they said they were going to overthrow the government. So white reporters from the major newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, all came down to cover what they called the race war in Carolina, and they repeated the narrative of the white supremacists, which is that Black men weren't intelligent enough to vote, and they were too corrupt and too incompetent to hold public office. And at the same time, there was a major a rape campaign by Black men, that Black men were coursing through the countryside and raping white women, which was completely false. And you mentioned Rebecca Latimer. She was the wife of a congressman in Georgia, and she gave a speech admonishing white men for not preventing what she said was an epidemic of rape, especially out in the countryside. And she said, I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary. She basically told white men to go out and lynch Black men for allegedly raping white women. Alex Manley in Wilmington was the editor of the Daily Record, which was a Black daily newspaper, which was a rare thing for a southern town at the time to have a Black daily paper. And he was an aggressive editor, and he called out the white supremacists. And in August, he wrote an editorial that shocked the South. In response to Felton, he said two things. One, that most Black men lynched for allegedly raping white women were in fact their consensual lovers, and that white women were attracted to Black men. And secondly, he pointed out that for generations, white men had been raping Black women with impunity. And this just set the whole South on fire. All the white newspapers reprinted the speech to spread the word out, to inflame white fears, and particularly in North Carolina, the goal of the white supremacists was to split off the white populace from the Black and white Republicans, and they did that by playing on racial fears. And so as the summer went on, and after Alex Manley's editorial, it just built to a crescendo. And at the same time, these red shirts and other whites were going to rallies, and they were a lot like Trump rallies. There were demagogues, speakers who were really skilled at race baiting and in really inflaming white men to protect their women. They were told that their birthright, their right to rule over Black men, had been taken away from them, and they had to rise up and do something about it. And that all culminated on November 10th, 1898 in the coup and the murders.
So in a sense, they were going to take their country back.
Exactly, and that's the same language that Donald Trump has been using.
Sure. And so, we talked at the top of the show about the fusionist government of North Carolina, when poor whites and poor Blacks got together and realized they had more in common with one another than they did with people like Josephus Daniels, editor of the Raleigh News and Observer. And so the white supremacist leadership, people like Alfred Waddell, who is really an empty suit. He's a very relatively unaccomplished, gives himself the title of colonel, if I'm not mistaken, is these poor whites, poor and middle-class whites, are responding to these triggers, a financial trigger, cultural trigger, sexual trigger. And on the other side, the enemy on the other side of all of those things is essentially Black men. So can you talk about, you mentioned it just a few minutes ago, the role of disinformation in the buildup to 1898, because something that they did that was very smart, and I've heard you speak about this before, the white supremacists, people like Waddell and McRae and these other leaders, Manley published that editorial response in August, and they put it in their back pocket and they waited. What were they doing with disinformation and planning during those intervening months leading up to November 10th?
Right. What was really interesting, the day that Alex Manley published his editorial, the red shirts rose up and said, "We got to lynch that guy right now." And the leaders of the white supremacy movement said, "No, now's not the time. We can make political use of this. We can inflame white voters by using this. We want to wait till the election in November, and then I promise you, you can burn down the newspaper and you can lynch Alex Manley." Well, Alex Manley got word of this just before the coup and escaped town with his life ahead of a lynch mob, but the paper was burned to the ground on the day of the coup. So after August, the white supremacists really, through the newspapers and through these speeches, but and you mentioned Colonel Waddell, he was actually a very impressive public speaker, even though he had an unimpressive resume. He had been a former congressman. He had briefly been an officer in the Confederacy and left because of ill health. But he was a very, I guess, compelling speaker, and he knew how to inflame white men, and he knew how to play, as you talked earlier about, their insecurities, that black men were coming to take their jobs, that black men were coming to take their women, and black men had stolen their birthright. And this all culminated in the stolen election and then in the coup, and by the way, in which at least 60 black men were murdered in the streets that day.
So can you take us through the election passes? Black men are either kept from the polls. The ballot boxes are overturned, stuffed, burned. There's distraction. There's rampant theft at the polls. So that passes on November 8th. Can you walk us through the events of the day of November 10th?
Right. The night before, there had been a meeting of the white leadership and of the red shirts, more than 1,000 white men, where they declared a declaration of independence for the whites and announced that what they called Negro rule, Negro domination, was over, and from then on, whites would rule, and that there would be a gathering the next morning at the Wilmington Light Infantry Armory to take back their city. And there was a huge gathering of not only of red shirts, but of armed white men. And all summer, white men had been arming themselves with Winchesters and shotguns and pistols. In fact, all of the gun stores ran out of weapons and ammunition, and they had to call to Richmond and Baltimore to get more ammo and more weapons. At the same time, the gun merchants refused to sell to black men. So you had this black population, first of all, that was terrorized, and second of all, really had no weapons to defend themselves. And third, there were 2 black companies that served in the Spanish-American War that were called up, but they were sent off to training camps in Georgia and deliberately kept away from Wilmington on the day of the coup. And at the same time, there were 2 white militias who were basically the National Guard of the day, the Wilmington Light Infantry and the Naval Reserves. And these men had also been, these were all white supremacists, led by white supremacists. They were supposed to answer to the governor in Raleigh, but in fact, they were commanded by white supremacists, the very white supremacists who were leading the coup. And so all these forces coalesced on the morning of November 10th at the Armory. They marched and they burned down Alex Manley's newspaper. The staff had fled, the place was empty, and they burned it down. And then they just started coursing through neighborhoods looking for black men to kill, ended up killing 60 of them. At the same time, they selected the leading black men that they didn't kill and the leading white politicians and banished them. They had what they called the banishment campaign, and they forced them at gunpoint to the train station and told them they were to get on the train, leave town, and never come back or they'd be shot on sight. And not one of them ever came back. And then later in the afternoon, after the killing dies down, the mob marches to City Hall and at gunpoint forces the mayor, the police chief, the city council, and the sheriff, who are all Republicans and populists, to resign. And as I mentioned earlier, the city council had 3 black members who were also forced to resign. And then the mob had a quote election and appointed the mob leaders in their place, and Waddell was appointed as mayor.
And so what we have, and we need to keep in mind that 1898 was a midterm election. So they suppressed the black vote with violence and intimidation. And then, all whites won the midterm on November 8th, but there was still a sitting government that they couldn't vanquish at the ballot box. So they vanquished them by force. And as this is obviously the only, well, maybe not obviously, but this is the most successful coup, the only successful coup in American history. And, I've heard you speak about this before, having spent as much time as you have in North Carolina growing up and going to school. I'm a native, public schools, public universities. I never heard a word about this. And then when I would hear about it in the early 2000s here in Wilmington or other places, it was always talked about as a race riot. So can you talk about how, to outsiders, the event was characterized as a race riot, when in reality it was a coup, it was a race massacre? And I'm thinking specifically about the events last Wednesday, right after they happened. From the floor of the House, Matt Gaetz, representative from Florida, says Antifa broke into the building, which we all knew was not true. And Kevin McCarthy, I guess it was yesterday, House Minority Leader said, no, Antifa did not break in. And so we're still trying to mischaracterize what our eyes see as being something other than fact. But can you talk about why it was important to the white supremacists to characterize this as a race riot and not a massacre?
Right. I mean, for years after 1898, as you point out, it was characterized as a race riot. And specifically, the narrative was that black men, not white men, were arming themselves and planning to rise up, take over the city, kill white men, and rape white women. And that was the justification they gave for the coup, in addition to what they claimed was black incompetence and black corruption in the government. For years, as you say, this was called a race riot, when in fact it was basically domestic terrorism, and it was a political coup. It was a coup based on white supremacy. And I just see a whole lot of parallels to what we saw in the Capitol the other day. The chief one being misinformation and disinformation, which we've talked about quite a bit. Well, that is Trump's specialty. For 2 months, he told his base, largely white, many of them white nationalists, some of them white supremacists, that the election was stolen from them. But the undertones was that your very country is being stolen from you by black, brown, and immigrant people. If you remember, even when he won the election in 2016, he said millions of illegal aliens voted, illegal immigrants.
5 million,
voted.
yep.
Yeah, I don't know how many he used, and then after losing this election, he specifically talks about black majority districts in cities like Philadelphia, Atlanta, and Detroit as just cesspools of voter fraud and ballot stuffing. So that message is very clear, that it's black and brown people and immigrants who are stealing your country from you. And this is the same message that the 1898 whites got from their leaders. There was also claims of a stolen election. I mean, as we know, Trump did, but in 1898, the white supremacists claimed that the election that put the fusionists in power and brought black men into government had been stolen as well. So there's that parallel. The scapegoating and the demonizing of people was the same on both occasions. And thankfully, the quote coup at the Capitol wasn't successful, but I think there's no other way to characterize it except as a political coup. The attempt was to overthrow a legitimately elected government, even before it got into power, and keep in power the previous government, which in a way was what the white supremacists were doing in 1898, overthrowing a legally elected government and putting the previous government back in power.
I agree wholeheartedly. Can you talk about, and I want to get to your questions for folks who are watching. We have we have a ton of people watching. I'm really excited by the enormous turnout we've got. If y'all have a question, go down to the Q&A box, type it in. I'm kind of flipping through them and seeing what would be specifically relevant to the conversation we're having. Make sure to mention your name and the name of your home bookstore. But David, to close us out here, to close out our conversation, can you talk about 1898 as a blueprint for the rise of white supremacy? We know Tulsa happened in 1921. We know Rosewood happened in 1923. We know the U.S. Capitol happened in 2021. So can you talk about the checklist of these events?
Right. You mentioned all these other so-called race riots, and in almost all of those, these were generally spontaneous outbursts of rage involving usually some sort of contact between a black man and a white woman. For instance, in Tulsa, it was supposedly a black man in an elevator who had made some sort of sexual approach to a white woman, and that set it off, even though it had been building for a while. Wilmington was unique in that it was premeditated. It was planned over a period of months. It wasn't a spontaneous outburst of white rage, and it certainly wasn't a race riot in the way that it was portrayed through history. What was the second part of your question?
Talking about 1898 as a blueprint.
Yeah. Oh, as a blueprint, right.
Checklist.
Yeah. Well, actually, after 1898, that was really a blueprint for the rest of the South to start passing laws aimed directly at keeping Black people from voting. Right after that, Wilmington passed, I believe, was the first Jim Crow law in the state, and it was for streetcars. But they also began making use of literacy tests and poll taxes and voter purges to keep Black people from voting. And it was so successful. I'll give you a couple of numbers. In 1896, there were 126,000 Black men registered to vote in North Carolina, 126,000. By 1902, 4 years after the coup, the white supremacists had whittled it down to 6,100. So that just shows you how effective they were. And essentially, Black people did not vote in any significant numbers from 1898 up until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1965. So that's almost 70 years, and shows you how successful they were. Other states followed suit. In I think it was 1904, there was a midterm election in Georgia where white supremacists were trying to do the same thing, trying to suppress the Black vote, intimidate Black voters, steal the election. And before the election, they consulted with the whites in Wilmington on how to go about it. So that just shows you how this set the blueprint for voter suppression throughout the South. That's been going on up until today. And one example is voter ID laws that are passed by white legislatures in the South and elsewhere, racial gerrymandering that tries to dilute Black votes by cramming them all into one district, which is what the white supremacists did in 1898 with the so-called Black Second, which was a district in eastern North Carolina where all the Blacks were packed in to leave other districts safe for Democrats. So this, in a lot of ways, this was just a blueprint that was followed throughout the South.
Here's a great question that comes in from Lexi at Scuppernong Books there in Greensboro, which is actually where I met you back in, I think that was February? In January, I think.
Yeah.
Lexi asks, what happened in the first weeks and months after the Wilmington coup? I know Furnifold Simmons became a senator. He was one of the kind of public faces, backroom dealers with for 1898. But in Wilmington, what happened in the city in the weeks and months ahead?
Well, first of all, immediately the new white leadership declared that all jobs that had been held by Black men would henceforth go to white men. And so they started purging whites. They fired every Black person who had been in city government. They disbanded the Black fire units, the fire companies. They fired the Black policemen and all the Black magistrates. At the same time, as you can imagine how terrifying this must have been for Black families, on the day of the coup, hundreds of Black people ran from their homes terrified and fled to the cemeteries and the swamps, where they spent 2 nights there before they had to be coaxed back. And in the weeks and months after the coup, 2,100 Black people left the city, and many more left after that. It was 56% Black in 1898. Today it's 18% Black. So you can see there was this massive exodus of Black citizens, which was exactly the goal of the white supremacists. And they essentially made white supremacy official city and state policy for the next 70 years. And you mentioned Ferdinand Simmons, who was the chairman of the Democratic Party. He was elected 30 years. He served 30 years as a U.S. senator. Three of the race-baiting stump speakers during the campaign were later elected governor, in large part on the fame that they built during their speeches during the white supremacy movement. Josephus Daniels served as Secretary of the Navy and ambassador to Mexico. And Waddell, as I mentioned, was appointed mayor by the mob, and then there was a phony election held 2 years later where exactly 5 Black citizens voted, and he was, quote, elected mayor again. So no one ever paid any penalty. No one was ever held accountable in any way for the murders in the coup.
Cindy asks, I don't know what Cindy's bookstore is, but Cindy asks, when was Ida B. Wells doing her investigative reporting? And I don't know the answer to that. Perhaps you do, but here's a follow-up question I have to that. With all of the progressive journalism that's occurring turn of the century up through World War II, how did Wilmington stay out of the muckraking journalist crosshairs after this event?
Yeah, it's because of the iron control that white supremacists had on city government and on county government in the years after the coup. And plus the newspapers were all white run, all run by white supremacists. And of course, they had burned down and eliminated a progressive Black voice, the only progressive newspaper in the city that was eliminated. So it was really a bastion of white supremacy. And I think if any reporters had come in snooping around, trying to do exposés, they would have either been killed or run out of town. And I don't think reporters really had the nerve to go into a city like Wilmington and start raising questions about how things ran. And I think that explains why Wilmington basically escaped the progressive reporting, particularly in the early 20th century around the country.
Blair has a great question. The Wilmington coup obviously has had a long-term effect on Black opportunity in Wilmington. I think it'd be a good opportunity for reparations where a very specific event happened that prevented the building of wealth for the Black population. What are your thoughts on using this as an example of a very specific opportunity for reparations? The city of Asheville, which I know you're familiar with, just announced a push for reparations.
I saw that.
And here we are in Wilmington, a city where people lost their homes overnight. They lost their businesses overnight, where you can, and I may be mistaken, but I want to say that the census records from 1900 are no longer available, or one year that it burned, the census records burned in DC. So it's hard to know who owned what when, but we know for a fact that generational wealth disappeared overnight in the Black community. So what would you think about Wilmington as a test case for reparations, for civic reparations?
What you would think it is an obvious test case. But what's interesting, in 1998, during the centennial of the coup, UNC Wilmington organized several events over a year trying to bring some reconciliation between the white and Black communities, and particularly among the descendants on both sides. And for the most part, there was some reconciliation and some really confrontation of what really happened, a confrontation of the lie and correcting the historical record. But the one subject that people stumbled over was reparations. And many of the Black descendants demanded some sort of reparations, and there was just absolute refusal in the white community and anger over even the thought of reparations. The typical response was, "I'm not responsible, for what my grandfather did. Let's move ahead. You're stirring up racial tensions. Why are you digging up, the past? Let's move ahead and let's move forward." So there was some reconciliation, but reparations was the one subject that really tore the town apart, and still is. There are still calls for reparations, and there's still refusals refusal in the white community to consider it.
Mark has a great question. Mark says, I was fascinated by your contrasting of the apparent success of the fusionists early on in Reconstruction to what happened in 1898. And also particularly the role Abraham Galloway played as a bridge from the Civil War to the hopefulness of Reconstruction. Can you talk about that? Abraham Galloway and his role in the Cape Fear region.
He was an amazing figure. And I have to say, before I started researching my book, I'd never really heard of him. And that's surprising. He was a pivotal figure in post-Civil War North Carolina. He had been a spy for the Union during the Civil War. He's an incredibly brave guy. He was a slave, escaped slavery on a boat. He stowed away on a boat from Wilmington that went up to Philadelphia. And just became really working for the Union. And he was more than any single person responsible for raising the so-called colored regiments during the Civil War. He recruited thousands of blacks to serve in the colored units during the Civil War. After the war, he was the probably central leader in Eastern North Carolina for getting the vote for black men and using the vote. He was one of the very first black men to be elected to the state Senate in North Carolina, and was just a fiery leader in Wilmington. In 1868, the Ku Klux Klan came to Wilmington to drive out blacks who were just starting to get the vote and just starting to get economic power. The Klan rose up, and Abraham Galloway led an informal black militia that drove out the Klan from Wilmington until the 1920s. So he was an absolutely amazing figure.
Pat asked a really important question. Where did blacks go who were run out of Wilmington? I know they jumped on trains, etc., but where did they go?
Most of them went north, as you can imagine. A lot of them went to relatives who lived in northern cities. Quite a few ended up in the Philadelphia, New Jersey area. Some went to New York. A lot went to Washington. Alex Manly spent the rest of his life in Philadelphia. George Henry White, who at the time was the one and only senator or black senator or congressman in the entire country. He was from the Black Second, so-called district right next to Wilmington. He ended up starting a town called Whitesboro in New Jersey. And quite a few people went up into New Jersey and the Philadelphia area.
And so, we have the early stirrings of the Great Migration. Right. This one not based on hope, but really truly based on fear.
Right.
Ivan asked Home Store Malaprops up in Asheville, what actions did the state and federal governments take after the coup in Wilmington?
That's a great question, and the answer is zero. Of course, the state government had been taken over by white supremacists, so they weren't about to do anything. But President William McKinley had been warned ahead of time that there was going to be a coup, that blacks were being intimidated and killed. And he was begged afterwards by black leaders and by Republicans to send federal troops to North Carolina and intervene, and also to raise a grand jury to arrest and convict those responsible. He never, from what I could find, never once uttered a single word in public about Wilmington. He absolutely refused to do anything. In large part because he was running for election in 1900 and he needed white Southern votes. Even though he was an abolitionist, had served in the Union Army, he really turned his back on the black voters who helped him get elected to as president. So that was a real betrayal. But basically, the federal government did nothing, absolutely nothing. And as I say, no one was ever held to account.
We've got some questions that are echoing questions that I'd asked. Joe at Scuppernong Books asked about the federal response. Ruth, Park Road Books in Charlotte, wondered about the property that was lost, the property belonging to black citizens. Benitra, her bookstore is Main Street Books in Davidson, North Carolina, asks, is there a difference between white supremacy and white nationalism?
I would think white supremacy obviously means that blacks are inferior, that whites should rule and are inherently superior. to Black people, and that was the beliefs of the white supremacists in 1898. I think white nationalism has to do with the belief that America was founded by white Christians and is a white Christian country. Brown, Black, and even immigrant people may be somewhat welcome, but they have to recognize that America is a white Christian country. I think that's the distinction in my mind.
We got a couple more questions here, and I got one that I want to tie it up with. Claire, Duluth, Minnesota, local bookstore, Zena's bookstore in Duluth. Claire asks, what can we do as citizens to make sure that history does not repeat itself? Thinking about what Santayana said years ago about those who forget the past being repeated. What can we do as citizens to make sure this doesn't happen again?
Well, I think a perfect example is Stacey Abrams and all the people in Georgia who had that long campaign to register Black people to vote and to fight voter suppression efforts. I think everybody can take a role in doing that and to helping all people register to vote and to fight in state legislatures around the country that are trying to pass voter ID laws and other forms of voter suppression, to raise your voice against that and vote out people who are trying to do that. I mean, that's a difficult thing to do, but you can't do it without being engaged. And know your history. I mean, the Wilmington coup was a very harsh lesson, and it really frightened me last week or 2 weeks ago when I saw the Confederate flag flying in the Capitol. I mean, the first time ever that I know of. So it shows we're not really learning the lessons of history.
To close this out, David, you've reported from Iraq, Lebanon, Africa, and you've spent, untold amounts of time researching 1898 here in Wilmington. Can you take the temperature of our present moment and just let us know kind of what you're feeling?
Yeah, the biggest thing in the last 4 years that shocked me is the strength of that undercurrent of white resentment and fear and grievances. I think that's been there, that Donald Trump just so brilliantly tapped into and exploited. And I think that's where we are now. I am really worried about the inauguration and what might or might not happen in Washington in the next few days, as far as these extreme right militia groups and others planning violence. But more so, I'm worried about the next 4 years. The Biden administration is not even in office yet, and I think there are plots right now underway to undermine it, sometimes with violence. So the temperature right now that I feel is anger and division.
Well, I hate to leave on that note, but
yeah, sorry.
Sometimes I think reality is the best note to go out the door on. So, David, it's been a pleasure. I've learned a lot talking to you tonight, and I hope our viewers, which we had a lot of them tonight, took something away from this as well.
Well, thanks, Wiley, for having me. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. And go out and pick up a copy of Wilmington's Live from your favorite independent bookstore in your home community. And please join us Tuesday, February 9th at 7 p.m. for Ariel Lawhorn, who's a friend of mine. And then 2 nights later, Thursday, February 11th at 7 p.m. for Jerry Mitchell. Ariel wrote a novel. Jerry wrote a nonfiction book, and both are equally fascinating. So please join us then. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight and for sitting through what is a tough thing to discuss and a tough thing to hear, but an important thing to confront. So thank you so much. Have a great night. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, everybody.